In this video, we'll talk about modus ponens. So modus ponens is a valid deductive argument form. If the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So a premise is a statement. So when we're doing philosophy, we're giving statements or reasons to support our conclusion. Statements can be true or false. So premise 1 reads, if A, then B. Premise 2 affirms A. In other words, A does happen. The conclusion, denoted by these three dots, is B. B happens. B is affirmed. So when a statement is given to you in the form of, if something happens, then something else will happen, that is always called a conditional statement. So there's two parts here. If A is the antecedent, then B is the consequent. So anything that goes with the if portion is the antecedent, and then the consequent, B, you can think of as the consequence of A. Another thing to keep in mind is that the order of the premises doesn't matter because we're talking about the substance and the structure of your argument. So whether you put A in premise 1 or if A then B in premise 2, it still will logically guarantee that B is affirmed. Now I'll create an actual argument in the form of modus ponens so we can see how it works in real life. If it is a shark, A, then it is a politician, B. Premise 2, it is a shark, A. The conclusion, denoted by these three dots, it is a politician, B. This argument is very unintuitive, especially when I tell you that it is valid. This is a valid argument by virtue of being in the modus ponens form. The reason it's valid is because it follows the format that we talked about earlier. If A, then B, A, therefore B. When we think of logic, this is not what we think of. We think of arguments that are true and make sense and have philosophical rigor and can be taken seriously. But if you can understand this example, then you will get over this huge learning curve that initially happens in symbolic logic. And that is where we make sure that we are differentiating the word valid from true. Just because an argument is valid, as you can see, does not make it true. So now it's very important to introduce the word sound. Sound arguments are valid, but also the premises are true. So an argument can be valid, such as this one, but not sound. This is not a sound argument because it is not true that if something is a shark, then it is a politician. So statements or premises have to be true or false, and ideally objectively true or false. So this is a valid argument, but not sound. And it's not sound because it's not true. Here's another example, and this one is a bit more serious in comparison to the last one. Premise 1 reads, if it is raining, A, then the ground is wet, B. Premise 2, it is raining, A, therefore the ground is wet. Right off the bat, this argument is valid. It is valid because it fits the modus ponens form. If A, then B, A, therefore B. Arguably the most important part of making arguments is the truth of the premises. In other words, are the statements true? If the statements are true, and if it follows a valid form of reasoning, then this conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So when we take a look at this argument as a whole, if it's raining, then the ground is wet. They're telling us it is indeed raining, So we can safely then conclude that the ground is wet. But if we truly scrutinize premise 1, we might come up with a counterexample of a world where it is raining, but the ground is not wet. It is possible that it's raining, yet there is some kind of awning or umbrella, or the floor was covered with a sandbox, and therefore the ground did not get wet. So since I can come up with a counterexample to premise number 1, that means that this is not a sound argument, because the premises would need to be true. This example, even though it may seem more serious than the shark is a politician example, they are, in the world of logic, equivalent because they are valid but not sound. The premises are not true. Now we're going to try and make an argument that is both valid and sound. In other words, the form will fit modus ponens and the premises or statements will be true. If it is a goldfish, then it is a fish. Premise 2, it is a goldfish. And the conclusion, it is a fish. So the conditional in premise 1, if A, then B is present. In premise 2, we're affirming A, and we are concluding B. So right off the bat, this is a valid argument, and it fits the modus ponens form. Can we now find any objection to the premise, if it is a goldfish, then it is a fish? If we can't come up with a counterexample, or if we could refute the truth of this premise, then this argument will not be sound. However, if it is a goldfish, then it is a fish is true. Every goldfish is a fish, so it is logically true 100% of the time, and there are no counterexamples. This argument meets all the requirements to be considered sound. The premises are true, and the form is valid. Now let's talk about fallacies. A fallacy is an error in reasoning. So if we look at this form right here, it looks very similar to modus ponens. If A, then B, B, therefore A. So the only thing that's different with this form and with the form of modus ponens is that in premise 2, we're affirming A. In this example, this person is affirming B. So if A happens, then B happens, and therefore A happens. In premise 1, we have a conditional statement. There is the antecedent A and the consequent B. And we said that B was the consequence of A. So in modus ponens, what we're doing is we are affirming the antecedent. In this fallacy called affirming the consequent, we are affirming B. Any argument that fits this form is invalid. This means that when we talk about truth and soundness, it is impossible for an argument that takes this form to ever be sound, because a sound argument needs to be valid in its form and have true premises. What I'll do now is I will take an example that we've already done, but put it in the form of the fallacy of affirming the consequent so we can see exactly where the reasoning falls apart. We previously made an example involving goldfish. That argument came out sound. It was valid under modus ponens and the premises were true. Now we're talking about the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So A is the antecedent. If it is a goldfish, B is the consequent. Then it is a fish. In premise 2, in order for it to have been modus ponens, we cannot affirm B, we could only affirm A. The author of the argument is assuming that once we state that something, this thing they're referring to, is a fish, means it's a goldfish. However, it could have been any other fish. It could have been a catfish. It could have been a bass. So just because the thing in question is a fish, we cannot safely guarantee that it is a goldfish. In premise 2, we need to affirm the antecedent. We need to say it is a goldfish, and therefore we can conclude it is a fish, but we can't do it the other way around. It must follow the modus ponens form and cannot follow a form like this, or your argument will be considered fallacious. If you're a philosophy major, then these examples so far probably do not feel like what you signed up for. So I want to try doing a philosophical example and see if we could make a sound argument in using a deductive form of reasoning such as modus ponens. If humans have free will, A, then they are morally responsible for their actions, B. Premise 2, humans have free will. The conclusion is they are morally responsible for their actions, B. What this person is trying to say is that if we have free will, then the things that we do are technically choices and our responsibility. The problem is that in premise 2, they're stating humans have free will. And the bottom line is we don't know if we do. And in order for an argument to be sound, the premises need to be true. So it's very difficult when using deductive forms of reasoning to insert opinions for your premise, because ideally we want objectively true premises. We want to be able to point to a premise and not come up with a counterexample. If we can successfully not find a counterexample and the premises are true and it fits a form like modus ponens, then we have a sound argument. This argument is valid simply by virtue of following the modus ponens formula. However, it is not sound. We cannot guarantee that humans are morally responsible for their actions. And the reason we can't guarantee that conclusion is because we simply don't know if it's objectively true that we have free will. What I want you to get out of this example is that when we're doing real philosophy, and philosophy that involves opinions or potentially subjective truths, such as issues in free will or religion, those premises will always probably be able to be challenged. And since premises that are challenged cannot be sound, then it's best to reserve argument forms like modus ponens for objectively verifiable empirical truths.